You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve your sex life. One of the most common challenges that couples face is that sex sometimes disappears almost entirely from the relationship. Sometimes this happens after having children. Sometimes it follows a stressful period at work or after a health issue. And other times there isn't an obvious turning point you can trace it back to. Couples who once had an active and satisfying sex life might suddenly find themselves having sex rarely, or perhaps not even at all. It's easy to assume that a quote-unquote dead bedroom must mean that someone has low libido, that the relationship has run its course, or that the couple has simply become incompatible. But the reality is much more complicated. Differences in sexual desire are incredibly common, and they're influenced by everything from stress and relationship dynamics to hormones, communication patterns, and changes in what we find pleasurable. In today's episode, we're taking a closer look at why dead bedrooms happen, how common they are, what the science says about sexual desire discrepancies, and how to know when it's time to seek help. My guest is Dr. Lauren Fogel-Mercy, a licensed psychologist, AASECT certified sex therapist, and certified emotionally focused couples therapist. She specializes in sexual health and relationships and owns a private practice in Minnesota. She is the co-author of the book, Desire, an inclusive guide to navigating libido differences in relationships. You can find her on Instagram and Facebook at Dr. Lauren Fogel-Mercy. This is going to be another fascinating conversation that you won't want to miss. Stick around and we're going to jump in right after the break. Do you ever find yourself dreaming about a career where you get to talk about sex and psychology all day long? What if I told you there's a place that can connect you with world-class experts and has a large, thriving community? Sexual Health Alliance does just that. Sexual Health Alliance helps you to build the career of your dreams and is at the forefront of sexuality education. Students come from all parts of the world and from all types of backgrounds. Whether you're in school just starting out on your journey or building advanced skills in your profession, Sexual Health Alliance's comprehensive certifications, engaging events, and self-paced online education will move you beyond the basics and set you up to become sexceptional. Visit sexualhealthalliance.com and start building the sexuality career of your dreams today. And let them know that you heard about Sexual Health Alliance on this podcast. Hi, Lauren, and welcome back to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you here as always. So today we're talking all about dead bedrooms. And the reason for this is because I've received a lot of listener questions about it lately. So as a starting point, let's talk definitions. So when people hear the phrase dead bedroom, it probably conjures up a very specific image for a lot of folks. But what does a dead bedroom actually look like? I mean, is there an objective definition of it, or can it look different in different relationships?
I do think it looks different in different relationships, but I think there is at least a common theme to how people talk about this. So when people talk about dead bedroom, which I'm not the biggest fan of because it seems like a pretty negative framing of this, assuming that it feels, that negative to everybody. But I think a lot of people are referring to a sexless relationship. And the most common definition of a sexless relationship is 10 or fewer sexual encounters in a year span. So that's what I've seen. I don't actually know where that goes back to. I've heard Barry McCarthy talk about that language, but I don't know, where it originated. But that seems to be the sort of understanding of what that means.
And I think that's a common misconception about this topic is that people assume that there's no sex at all happening, but sometimes sex might still be happening just at a very low frequency. It's one of those things where it's kind of hard to say, is this about the actual frequency of sex, or is it about how satisfied you are with the sex that you're having? Because some people have sex very infrequently, but they're perfectly content with that, right?
Absolutely. And it is based on this assumption, right, that more frequency equals more satisfaction, right? There are a lot of people having frequent sex that they are not enjoying, not finding satisfying, showing up for because they feel like they have to or out of obligation. And so I wouldn't necessarily say that that is the goal or the objective here is to have more sex just because that is some benchmark of satisfaction.
And I think that's a really important point because if you're having sex with low frequency, but you're perfectly content with that, that's not a problem. We don't want to create problems where problems don't exist. So one of the things that surprises many people is just how common this issue is. So from your own clinical experience and what the research says, how prevalent are quote unquote dead bedrooms or significant desire discrepancies? How often do you see this in your work?
I obviously have a skewed sample size because I work with people who come in with sexual concerns, but this is a huge part of my work in terms of how often we're seeing this. There's estimates that, 15 to 20% of people in a given year are sexless or what you would call dead bedroom. And again, that could be anything from no sexual encounters at all to up to, a few or up to 10 at a time in a year. But desire discrepancy, we don't actually have great numbers to tell us exactly where this falls. Research is still sort of trying to figure this out. In my experience and from what I've read and written about, that this is extremely common for partners. You're going to have two or more people with different desires, different ideas, different wants. And so it's extremely common. So we think about a desire discrepancy as something that's going to happen at least sometimes or more perpetually in a partnership.
Somebody can have a desire discrepancy, but not have a technical dead bedroom, right? They might still be having sex with some frequency. It's just maybe one partner would like to be doing it quite a bit more than the other. So desire discrepancy goes along with dead bedrooms, but it can also exist independently of that as well.
Yes, exactly. It's about how you're navigating or managing that.
So when it comes to these dead bedrooms and desire discrepancies, gender stereotypes often enter the picture. So people tend to imagine that it's a heterosexual relationship in which a man wants more sex than his wife or girlfriend. But in reality, desire discrepancies can go in any direction, and they're not just limited to heterosexual folks, right?
Absolutely. I work with plenty of queer partners who are experiencing desire discrepancy just the same as their heterosexual counterparts. So it's definitely not just a straight thing. It's independent of gender and it's independent of orientation.
And some of the questions that I've received recently have actually been from women in heterosexual relationships who want more sex than their male partners. And so, yeah, you can see this going off in any direction. But I just think it's important to mention that because people often assume that it's this one-sided thing where it's always men wanting more sex than women, but that's not the reality of how it looks.
That's just not the case. That's the stereotype and certainly what we see and hear more of. And I have a theory that sometimes we're not hearing from these women or counterpart men who have lower desire, in part because that is so stigmatized. It's even more challenging to reach out and name this and ask for help and, share that out in the open.
So when couples first start having sex, desire often feels effortless, right? But, in the beginning, when you've got that passion and intense connection, the sex usually comes pretty easy. But somewhere along the line, sex often starts happening less. And that's normal. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a problem, although people often think that it is. So when does a drop in sexual desire or sexual activity become an issue in need of treatment? Like, how do we disentangle the normal waning of passion that tends to happen in long-term relationships from a true sexual problem?
There's an assumption that if you are not having sex, you're miserable or your partnership is in real trouble and you're heading for a split or divorce. And the truth is that people experience this in different ways. It's sort of a spectrum in and of itself. There are some people who are really bothered by this and some people who are quite content with the relationship that they have. And so in the sexual health world, we're often talking about subjective experience because if you are not distressed by something, then it may not be something that we have to do anything about, right? We don't just have some external metric that says it has to look a certain way. I mean, we do socially, unfortunately, lots of messages that say that. But if you're not bothered by something, that doesn't necessarily mean then there's a problem. What tends to be challenging is if one person is not bothered by it and another partner is bothered by it. And then there's a relational, dilemma and dynamic that we have to address and figure out how do we navigate that long term.
And that's something I want to dive into more in the next episode when we're talking about specific practical tips on how do you manage and deal with the situation, because it is oftentimes the case that you'll have one partner who's not bothered by this, but the other partner is. And that's a different dynamic, and that's hard to address compared to when both partners are bothered by this and they're both kind of on the same page that they want to make a change. But we'll get into that more a little bit later. So when couples come into your office struggling with a dead bedroom, what are the most common underlying causes? And how often is the problem really about sex itself versus something else that's going on, like stress or health problems?
I see a smattering of both in my practice. So I primarily work as a sex and relationship therapist, and desire discrepancy is my number one specialty. And so when people are coming in, I like to say that anything that can affect you can affect your desire and your sexuality, right? Anything from stress, the relationship, kids being in the next room, what's going on in the environment, everything can have a role, and there's many factors involved. I don't know that I've put numbers to it, but, it seems like just as many times that there's, relational challenges, stress, anxieties, there are also, challenges around how sex tends to look, how that tends to go, and that it's kind of rote, going through motions, and looks very sort of linear and scripted. And that starts to be disincentivizing for at least one person in couples oftentimes. And what I see often is, one person will be really happy with the script and they like the script and it works for them. And another person is saying, the script doesn't work for me every time. And so it's not motivating anymore. It's not, enjoyable or satisfying. And so that is part of why they are opting out.
So sometimes it is about sex, and it's about at least one person feeling that the sex that they're having isn't fulfilling or satisfying or meeting their needs. But oftentimes sexual problems aren't really about sex. They're about something else that's going on in your life. I think, as you mentioned, this is a really important point that, almost anything that creates stress in general in your life can affect your sex life in these very important ways. And so part of dealing with some of these issues is often looking at broader lifestyle and other factors and things that are going on, but also looking at the relationship itself, because if there's deep resentment or poor communication patterns in the relationship, that's obviously going to impact how much you want sex with your partner and how much you're going to enjoy that sex. So there can be a whole lot of different things going on. And, there can also be personal health issues involved here as well. Some of the listener questions that I've had recently have centered around cases where one partner develops a sexual dysfunction. So I heard from one heterosexual woman who said that her male partner started having erectile difficulties, and that is part of it, the core of why they're not really having sex anymore, but he's not really interested in getting treatment for it. And so that's kind of creating this issue in the relationship. And so there can be a lot of different things going on here. I like to think of sexual desire discrepancies as being biopsychosocial issues, right? That there are biological and hormonal influences on desire, but then there's also our own unique psychology. And then there's also the context of the relationship and the communication patterns. And so I think, for someone like you working as a sex and relationship therapist, you kind of have to do a lot of detective work to figure out, what's really at the core of this issue.
Absolutely. And the biopsychosocial model is what we root our work in, because it can be too myopic, or it can do a real disservice to people to not look at various factors or all the factors that can be contributing to the experience of sex or the concern around the relational discrepancy. And I see people jump really quickly to hormones or jump really quickly to something's wrong with the relationship. And those can be true. And also, they're not always true. And there's dozens of things that can be going on. It also really doesn't take into account how responsive desire works, which is a different sort of mechanism than spontaneous desire. And so for so many people, not realizing that they have more predominantly responsive desire, meaning that the pleasure or the stimulus needs to start up first, and then the desire to move into sex follows from that. And so if that's how you predominantly experience desire, it's going to look like you're, quote unquote, broken or something's wrong, when you just may have a different sort of way of getting into sex, and just knowing how that works and having a bit more understanding of what kind of conditions and context you need to make sex be enjoyable.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point that partners in relationships can just have very different styles of desire. And that can be part of what's at the root of this particular situation. Now, one thing I've noticed is that couples will often start telling a story where one partner is the one who always wants sex and the other is the one who never does. And I imagine those labels can actually become kind of self-fulfilling over time. But I think they're also so unhelpful because blaming and shaming each other for your level of desire is just not a productive path to go down. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how we need to reframe sexual desire discrepancies as a relationship issue instead of just one person having a libido problem.
Yeah, that's exactly how we talk about it and how we frame it in sex therapy and in writing about this. It's just really unhelpful to, pin this on one person, because if you take that person out of the relationship, the problem usually goes away in terms of, the person who has higher desire might be seeking out more sexual experiences as a single person or having open relationships. The quote unquote lower desire partner may just be going about their life and not that concerned about it. So it really does show up within the relational dynamic. And so we treat it as a relational issue because it's important to look at, again, all of the different variables that can be present. And even if there's, for example, a health concern that is contributing a large part to this equation, there's often still dynamics that emerge in terms of, like you said, it can be sort of self-fulfilling or become sort of a loop where it's like the more one person wants and the more one person doesn't. And then that's a feedback loop that they get stuck in. And there are just very common patterns to what this sounds like, feels like, looks like, and how it plays out. And so really important, I think, to have, if we can, sort of both or all partners coming to the table to look at this together, to approach it together, and to, take away sort of this stigma or this idea that it's one person's fault or problem.
So when we talk about desire discrepancies, we often describe people as either the higher desire partner or the lower desire partner. But I think it's important to recognize that those labels are relative, right? So someone who has the lower libido in one relationship might actually have the higher libido if they were in a different relationship with a different partner. So does that mean that we sometimes misunderstand desire discrepancies, right? So is the issue usually that one partner has clinically low desire, or is it more often the case that two people simply have healthy but different levels of sexual desire?
I think we're at a loss sometimes for how to frame this or how to word this. That's sort of the best that we've come up with so far, is like the higher or the lower. But you're right in that, somebody could be the lower desire partner in a relationship, switch partners, and then be the higher desire partner in another relationship. So these are not often static and they aren't always traits. Sometimes it can be a trait, and it might just be that you on the libido spectrum are on the lower side, and that's just part of who you are. But it can also very much be a state and just about the context of that particular relationship or that time in your life. It also happens that these roles can flip-flop over time. It's not uncommon to hear that somebody was once the higher libido partner and is now the lower libido partner in the same relationship. So that really speaks to the fact that it's not always a trait, and it often can be something that fluctuates with context, with age, other variables that are involved.
And that all fundamentally gets to how desire is complex. So when a couple stops having sex, they often stop talking about it too. And while avoiding the conversation might reduce conflict in the short term, I imagine it often allows the problem to grow much bigger over time. So what happens when couples avoid talking about their sexual relationship for months or even years? And does that make a dead bedroom all the harder to reverse when you're also lacking this sexual communication?
Yeah, I think it can be challenging, unless not having sex is an agreement that you have together and everybody's like, this just is the season, or this is where we're all fine with it, then you may not have to touch base about it. You may not really have to talk about it. But if one person is struggling with that or is grappling with what to do with their desire and missing that kind of intimacy or wishing that there was something that could look different, it often does help to have some pathway, at least some of the time, to be able to voice that, not from a place of pressure, but from a place of vulnerability and connection, and just being able to say, hey, this brings up feelings for me sometimes. And, what we don't want to do is create a pressured environment where somebody feels like they have to show up or bad things are going to happen. But just being able to talk, and I see that as an extension of the emotional connection, right? In, more secure relationships, there's really not topics that are off limits that we can't at least try to approach together. And so we have to be really thoughtful about this, because if there's a lot of tension or disconnection in the relationship as a whole, starting off from a place of talking about sex can be really inflammatory for the relationship at times. So we might have to just be thoughtful and delicate. And this is often what we're doing in sex and relationship therapy, is figuring out where there are tension points and in what order to address some of those concerns.
So in your clinical practice, since you deal with this issue a lot, how long has this been going on for the types of people that you're seeing? Are we talking about an issue that's months or years or decades, or do you see the whole spectrum? How long does a dead bedroom last before people are coming to seek help from you?
I see the whole spectrum. It is a very common story that the first, 6 months to 2 years, that new relationship energy or honeymoon phase, where a discrepancy doesn't emerge yet or doesn't seem to have, to be a problem. That can often be because if someone has more responsive desires, sort of their primary style, that can sometimes look more spontaneous in the forming of a relationship when there's a lot of novelty and excitement and passion, like you said. And then as there's more comfort and familiarity, it can kind of move back to a more responsive state. And so that discrepancy seems to kind of come out of nowhere, when it actually, for many people, is a pretty predictable stage of the relationship where their desire doesn't just vanish, it changes in terms of how to cultivate it. But by the time people are coming to see me, it's often after years or decades. Occasionally someone's coming in with, a few months under their belt, but usually people are building the distress over time and get to a point where they're just in such a place where they don't know what else to do, that they come and see what we can do together in therapy.
Something I was thinking about before the show is how there's been all this talk in recent years about a so-called sex recession, right? And what we see in the data is that across many populations, both single people and those who are in relationships are reporting having less sex on average than they did in previous decades. And so what I was wondering was, do you think that broader trend toward us having less sex means that dead bedrooms might be becoming more common? Or do you see the sex recession and the dead bedroom phenomenon as two totally different things?
It's a great question. I don't know if they're the same or related. I mean, I think they're probably speaking to a similar phenomenon. And I also wonder if there's generational differences as well, because I think younger people are growing up with fewer messages of having to have sex in order to, keep a marriage. Laws have changed over the years that have given women more, choice, and consent within a marriage is only something that, with marital rape laws, I think this was the 70s in some states, where, it was otherwise okay to just sort of force sex upon a wife. And so I don't necessarily see this as automatically something to be concerned about. I think, again, it goes back to, how do people feel about this? And what does that really mean? My understanding is we don't have clear data sometimes on what that means. Is that just intercourse is down? Or does that include other forms of sexual intimacy, other forms of physical touch? So it's not always clear from the research what exactly that means. But if it means that, some people are feeling like they can actually say no to sex that they don't want, that might actually be a good thing.
Yeah. And I think that's such an important point when we talk about the sex recession is, all right, people are having less sex on average, but is that necessarily a bad thing? Well, as you mentioned, like if people are opting out of sex that wasn't meeting their needs or that they didn't want to have in the first place, like that's a positive thing. But if they want to be having sex, but they can't, that's a different scenario or situation. So as you mentioned, sometimes couples are waiting years, maybe even decades before they go seek help because they assume that things will eventually improve on their own, or they're just trying different things and seeing what sticks. So at what point should people stop hoping the problem will just resolve itself and start viewing it as something that, they really need to actively address and get some outside help? What are the signs that it's time to see a professional?
I think you don't have to wait until your distress is at a 10 to come seek help. And this goes for general relational therapy as well, right? The longer you wait, the more resentment, pain, hurt builds. And that becomes just, more and more layers we have to sort of tease through in the therapy. And it just means that it's going to take maybe more longer to get to where we want to be and feeling more connected and stabilized. So I think, I caution not to come in the first time this ever happens, because we don't want to jump to a conclusion that like, this happened twice, now we need help. I want to normalize that there are fluctuations in a sexual relationship, but we also don't want to wait until that's just festered to a point where you feel like you're breaking and the relationship is at stake. Somewhere in between those two sort of extremes is ideal, but I don't know that there's an exact, number that's going to work for everybody. I also realize that some of these resources are not always accessible. And so there are some great books out there, podcasts like this one, courses, webinars, things that you can take, because I know sex therapy isn't always easy to access.
When it comes to defining sexual problems, a lot of definitions will give a time period of like 6 months or longer. And it's because life happens, right? And sometimes for a period of several months, you might be under high stress. Like maybe you just had a new child enter the picture, or you moved to a new city and started a new job, or you lost your job. Like there can be all different kinds of things that are going on that might have this sort of longer term impact on desire for one or both partners in the relationship. And so that's why you probably don't, as you said, want to go seek out a sex therapist when you have a problem just 1 or 2 times or something like that. It needs to be a persistent, ongoing pattern that's creating distress. But I think you're so right that it's better to not wait till that distress level reaches a 10 on the scale, because it does just become so much harder to address any problem when you just allow it to fester for years and years and years, and all of that resentment continues to grow.
It's sort of like a physical ailment. I often will sort of use that as a metaphor. Like, don't wait till your arm is like fallen off before you go in and seek some help. Like if you're starting to see some signs that something's just not right and it keeps aching, like let's go get it looked at and see what we can do.
Dead bedrooms can get better, right? And I would assume that, in your work as a sex therapist, you've seen many success stories, although we know that it's not always going to work for everybody. But I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about how this is a problem that can be fixed, it can be addressed. And, are there any factors that maybe predict with greater likelihood when a couple is going to recover and find a path through this and when they aren't?
It definitely is something that we can work on. And in many cases, we see a lot of improvement in satisfaction. That doesn't always look like what people think it will look like when they come in for sex therapy. A lot of people think that they're going to come in for sex therapy and we're going to have a certain amount of frequency that we're going to guarantee, or that certain sex acts are going to happen, or that we're going to eliminate a desire discrepancy. And all of those are largely unrealistic goals for coming in, although I totally understand why people have those expectations. But there's a lot we can do. I think the best outcomes are when there is a sense of sexual flexibility among all partners, where we are not fixed on, like we're saying, if it's not once a week or 3 times, then it's a bust. Or if it doesn't involve penetration every time, then you're just completely unsatisfied. Where there's enough flexibility to say, hey, we understand that relationships go through seasons. We understand that we're going to have differences and that we can have different ways of being sexually intimate that can flow and ebb over the course of a lifetime, because sex is likely to change either temporarily or more permanently the longer you're with somebody, as your body changes and ages with the development of, certain illnesses or disability. And so the more rigid you are about how sex has to be, the more likely you're going to struggle.
And that's something we see in the data, is that for people who retain these very rigid, very narrow definitions of sex as they get older, they tend to be less sexually satisfied because they're trying to make sex fit this one specific box or mold, when in reality, sex can be a lot of different things. So there's a lot to be said for having a more flexible and adaptable approach to sex. So this has been a fantastic conversation, Lauren. I'm really looking forward to continuing our conversation in the next episode and talking all about practical strategies for dealing with dead bedrooms. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work and get a copy of your book?
Sure. You can find me on my website, drlaurenfogel.com. I'm also on social media at Dr. Lauren Fogel Mercy.
And your book is called?
Desire, an inclusive guide to navigating libido differences in relationships, with my amazing co-author, Dr. Jennifer Wenzel.
Great. And I'll be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. Thanks again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Thanks for having me back.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.